Of the 6 candidates for governor so far this year, there are 2 men who are not Democrats. Leo Suter is a member of the Alabama Conservative Party, but never in Alabama history has a Conservative Party member ever been elected to governor. Emory Farmer is a Republican, and if he's elected, he would be the first Republican governor since Reconstruction, when Lewis Parsons served in 1865, Robert Miller Patton in the mid to late 1860s, William High Smith served in the late 1860s, and David Peter Lewis served in the early 1870s. Most of them were appointed and not elected. There have been 31 Democratic terms of governor since Lewis, and there are 4 Democrats who are hoping to continue that trend this year. One of them is Lieutenant Governor George McMillan. In the history of Alabama statehood, there hasn't always been a lieutenant governor, but there has always been a presiding officer of the Senate, which now is essentially the same office. Of 22 men who have held that position, there are only 7 men who later were elected to governor. The last time was Thomas Kilby, elected governor in 1919. The only other presiding officer of the Senate to be elected to governor in the 20th century is William James Sanford, elected to office in 1900. The others include Thomas Say in 1886, Rufus Cobb in 1878, Robert Patton in 1865, John Winston in 1853, and Gabriel Moore in 1831. Another Democratic candidate for governor is House Speaker Joe McCorkadale. Only 5 men out of 57 who have served as Speaker have ever later been elected governor, and none during the 20th century. The last one was Thomas Jones in 1890. There was also Andrew Moore in 1867, John Gale in 1831, Clement Clay in 1835, and Arthur Bagby in 1837. The last 2 Democratic candidates in this year's elections are Jim Folsom and George Wallace. Both are former governors. Both are among only 4 men in Alabama history to ever serve more than 1 term. Folsom twice, once beginning in 1947 and again in 1955. Bibb Graves served 2 non-successive terms in the 1920s and 30s, and William Jelks served 3 successive terms beginning in the 1900s. Other than Jelks, Wallace is the only man ever to have served successive terms, and only because the law was changed in 1968 to allow it. If Wallace does win another term, he would become the only man in Alabama history to have served 4 terms. Chris Grimshaw, WSFA TV News at the Capitol.
These inmates were burglars, thieves, and drug abusers. They were released because they were nearing the end of their sentences and because a federal judge said the prisons were too crowded and something needed to be done to relieve the situation. Of those 277, 57 were turned over to various sheriffs, other states, and the federal government to face other charges. Now, 36 of those inmates are back behind bars in Alabama. But prison officials say that's a smaller number than they expected.
So many people at that point were saying, well, these people are going to be back in a month, and half of them will be back about the end of the year or so. And of 277 inmates, and actually 220 who actually saw freedom, and only 9% of those returning. It is surprising.
Breaking it down, 3 of the inmates are now serving time for murder, 9 for theft and burglary, 7 for robbery, 4 for grand larceny, 2 for drug convictions, and 1 each for forgery and the Youthful Offender Act. Tate says the overall recidivism rate is 12.6%. Gina Gregory, WSFA TV News.
I'm just going to say what I would do, and you'll have to ask other people about that, but I'm going to run a positive campaign, and I'm saying how I'm going. Okay. Thank you. And as far as prosecuting attorney in various counties throughout the state to prosecute criminal cases, I am concerned about our community.
At ceremonies at Maxwell Air Force Base this evening, Commander of Air University, Lieutenant General Charles Cleveland, talked about the bravery of servicemen held captive by the enemy and about the servicemen in Southeast Asia that still haven't been accounted for by the North Vietnamese. The featured speaker at the observance held at the Montgomery VA Hospital, former State Senator Burt Bank, knew well what POWs went through. He was captured by the Japanese and survived the Bataan Death March. When he was liberated from the POW camp by American soldiers, he weighed 102 pounds and was totally blind. Bank was also concerned about the men that were listed as missing in action in Vietnam and still have not been accounted for.
In my opinion, General, the federal government should exercise every effort within its power to ascertain if those men are alive, where they are, so that those families can quit grieving with a small ray of hope that they must have.
The ceremonies were a time to reflect on the price Americans have paid for freedom and to remember when freedom was a dream, shut in by barbed wire fences. John Phelps, WSFA TV News.
His so-called war on illiteracy we had problems with because, as we pointed out to him, there's a war going on every day in the classrooms against illiteracy, and there was 100 years before he came to office. While I know he's proud of the achievements of his administration, I think sometimes the real people achieving those accomplishments tend to get forgotten, and that is the people in the classroom doing the teaching. What has happened to education since he took office, and it would have been terribly hard for the need.
They're going to say, I don't know what kind of an organization that is. Landing in the installation. And we debated about having Earl Darrington come back over from Mississippi.
I have the honor of installing the members. James Denson.
Larry, coming from you. You're the sponsor of this.
Veterans of World War II and Korea. If I am successful and have become a member of the Senate and have the privilege of serving with Burt Bank in that august body, I shall introduce legislation.
Been out of town a couple of times, and I called him. He's out on his farm tractor, and I talked to his pretty bride, and she said, it's psychic every time I...
Le Mans may have its road racing and Boston its marathon, but the small South Alabama community of Andalusia is home of the World Domino Championship.
Andalusia is a comfortable community where the folks' lifestyle is quite leisurely.
But the pace picks up this weekend when hundreds of players from all across the country sit down at these folding tables at the local junior college gymnasium. And believe me, they take this thing seriously.
Well, it's the next thing to football, probably. You know how football is in the state.
Woo, do they take it seriously?
Real serious. All of them do, especially people from Alabama and this town really do.
And one of the most serious players here is Ronnie Childers, who wants to take the World Championship home to Roswell, Georgia.
I take this as serious as anybody that's a baseball star, except so far in life this just is not, don't pay as much as baseball, but maybe sooner or later it'll get up to that position.
But luck wasn't with Ronnie in the singles competition this time. His concentration may have lapsed for a moment with all the hoopla fellow contestants made over this celebrity player, Alabama head football coach Bear Bryant, who flew into town long enough for his annual appearance and a quick game. The competition continues tomorrow with doubles and the finals on Sunday afternoon at 1. Bob Howell, WSFA TV News in Andalusia.
Here in New Orleans called from Dallas. He said at the last minute he changed his plans and didn't fly to Las Vegas and flew to Dallas instead. Of course, his phone call brought tremendous joy and relief for that one family. Elsewhere here at the airport, Pan Am officials are not releasing any new information about either the flight, the crash, or the passengers. So for now, it's still a matter of waiting, and for many New Orleans families, hoping against hope. Nancy?
Thank you very much, Clancy, and we will have more in a moment.
Combing through the rubble. Our officers will be on duty all night long. It's just like cleaning up after a bombing in that area. It is, the firemen will be there, the Jefferson police are here, Jefferson Parish police are here, Harahan police has come to assist. All the police agencies are assisting us in this operation.
Ruth, earlier we were warned that there might be problems with looters. Has there been such a problem?
Yes, we arrested one man. He was caught at 5:45 this evening. He is Lex Chipinelli, 25, of 4257 Rome Drive in Kenner. He is charged with theft and possession of stolen things.
All right, thank you very much. Ruth Barnett from the Kenner Police Department.
The crash has devastated the Kenner community. Willard Shepard reports the plane wiped out almost everything in its path.
Residents were devastated by the crash. The plane hit near 17th and Fairway. It wiped out homes in the area and left wreckage everywhere. Parts of the plane were on rooftops, in backyards, on front lawns. Firefighters battled blazes that were caused by the crash. Foam and water were used to cool the wreckage. Some homes were totally wiped out, while immediately next door, others stood intact.
All right, well, I live on Hudson Street, which is about 2 houses away when it happened. I just got through cutting the grass, and I went inside. The big, great boom, like you wouldn't believe, went off. We thought the lightning hit a transformer. Well, my wife said, God, what was that? I said, I don't know, honey. I said, let's go see. As soon as we come out, we looked out the door. There's a piece of the engine standing in the middle of Hudson Street. Flame.
Hospital emergency workers combed through the wreckage looking for survivors. Every possible sheriff's deputy and firefighter was called to the scene, hoping to find people who were still alive in nearby homes. Emergency workers only found one small child alive. Willard Shepard, News Center 6.
And this just into News Center 6. Apparently a Marrero woman was aboard the plane when it crashed. She is identified as 83-year-old Elizabeth Gidrose, who was en route to Las Vegas to visit her grandsons. This information comes to us from the Las Vegas airport. The call went out tonight for blood for those injured on the ground in that plane crash.
Like everybody else, I figure I do my part. It's just it. Got some extra blood, give it to somebody that needs it.
Doctors will use the platelets from the blood in the treatment of the burn victims. The center will stay open until 11 o'clock or until most of the people waiting in line have donated their blood. The center will reopen again tomorrow at 8 o'clock in the morning. Mark Phillips, News Center 6.
The Pan American plane tore through several blocks of houses, setting many homes on fire before it finally exploded. Black smoke covered the entire area some 2 miles from the New Orleans airport. Hours after the accident, fire departments from 4 cities poured water and foam onto the burning wreckage and debris. The remains of the plane's fuselage came to rest on top of a station wagon. Late this evening, rescue crews were still searching for survivors. The burn center at one hospital was placed on 24-hour duty, and a citywide call for doctors was put out, as well as a plea for blood donors. Fire officials say by early this evening, most of the fires were brought under control, but officials reported that they expected to be putting out spot fires throughout the night. Eyewitnesses described the accident as something out of a war movie. One woman says she heard the plane flying low over her house just before the crash. She thinks she heard the engine cut off. Fire officials say as many as 30 to 60 houses may have suffered damages. Robin Lloyd, NBC News, New Orleans.
Good afternoon. Tonight's top news, tonight's only news, the crash of a Pan Am 727, that crash on takeoff from New Orleans Airport this afternoon. The plane lifted off the east-west runway, then plunged into a residential area of Kenner. That crash now being called the second worst single air disaster in American history. It killed at least 145 people on board, 136 of them passengers. Alec Gifford at this time is standing by in the crash site in Kenner, where rescue workers are still searching for the victims that may remain from that crash on the ground. Alec?
That's right, Nancy. We're standing here with Sheriff Harry Lee. We'll be talking with him in just a moment. Here's what's going on back there. I just came back from the scene. Rescue workers are sifting through the wreckage of the homes, and it is total devastation back there. Homes totally wiped out by the jetliner as it came down. We're at a command post about 2 blocks away from the scene of the crash, about a mile east of New Orleans International Airport, where the plane went down about 5 or 6 hours ago. Sheriff Harry Lee is back there directing part of the rescue operation. What's it like, Sheriff Lee?
Well, it was a while before we controlled the fire. They were very much concerned. The Kenner Fire Department was in charge. Up until the fire was secured, there was about 40,000 pounds of fuel still on board. So we couldn't commence the rescue operation until the fire department gave us the okay. Very fortunate, I don't know if you already heard or not, they recovered a baby. It looked like she was about 18 months or 2 years old.
Yes, as a matter of fact, we do know that. We'll have pictures of that scene later in the newscast.
She was there, but it appears that as of this hour, when we just left there 10 minutes ago, there seemed to we've recovered about 80 bodies so far.
80 bodies have been recovered so far.
Yes.
Sheriff, what's the situation for the rest of the night now?
Chief Lentini has asked some of his people to go home to get some rest, and we've asked some of our people to go home. We're going to continue operations throughout the night. The Pan Am officials just arrived right before you did from New York. FAA has been on scene immediately after the accident. They're looking at the investigation, and all we're doing now is trying to recover the bodies.
Is there any reason to believe there may be survivors like that baby boy or baby girl in there?
No, I think that was a miracle. It's the whole area is cleared out and wiped out, and there was one particular area, we don't know why, there was about 20 bodies in one location. The only big part of the plane left is the tail section that we saw, and we're getting calls all the time that there's parts of the airplane all over the area.
All right, Sheriff Lee, I know you want to get back in there, so we'll let you go. And Nancy, we'll be coming back later in this half hour to bring you hopefully a further report of what's going on in there. But as we say, it is total devastation. It is a eerie scene of lights and smoke still coming up from the ground there. Rescue workers still recovering bodies. As Sheriff Lee just told you, 80 bodies already recovered. We'll be going back to the scene and we'll report back to you in about just a few minutes as soon as we return. Back to you, Nancy.
All right, thank you, Alec. And I think that was 18 bodies that have been recovered so far. The crash has been described as the second worst single airplane disaster in U.S. history. Elizabeth Curran reports on how it all happened.
There was virtually no recognizable trace of the airplane from the wreckage. The Boeing 727, just like this one, took off from New Orleans International Airport at 4:09 this afternoon. At 4:11, it went down, cutting a path of destruction through 2 blocks of homes.
You wouldn't believe a gas explosion when it wiped out the house over there on 17th and Fairway. The house was completely demolished, and the gas was shooting straight up about 100 feet. Then besides that, I looked over. The fumes from the plane was going up about 300 feet. So all I could think of was get the people out of the houses. So we went from house to house, me and a couple other guys, and we got all the people out.
There were many other such heroes in the wake of the crash. 143 people were on board when the plane went down. 14 first-class passengers, 122 coach class, 4 flight service attendants, and 3 in the cockpit. The Pan Am Flight 759 originated in Miami and was ultimately destined for San Diego after a stopover in Las Vegas. The crash site, about 2 miles from the airport near 17th Street, was strewn with rubble, and smoke filled the air because the plane apparently exploded after it went down. The death count continues to rise, but just as officials had given up hope of any survivors in the wreckage, a 16-month-old little girl was found alive. Elizabeth Curran, News Center 6.
And we will have more on that child's condition later in this newscast. Red Cross officials say there will be a moratorium of at least 24 hours on the names of those who died in that crash. Red Cross spokeswoman Pat Jackson says the bodies were badly burned and it will take days for forensic specialists to go through the rubble. Jackson says at this point there is no way to get an accurate body count. A Red Cross official says people checking on survivors can call the New Orleans Red Cross at 586-8191, 586-8191. The Red Cross will take your name and number, and when information can be released, inquiring relatives and friends will be called. After Flight 759 went down, members of the families of those aboard were rushed to a VIP room at the airport, where they have remained with Pan Am officials. Clancy Dubose is at the airport. Clancy?
Nancy, the scene here at the airport is one of grim contrasts. In the VIP room, as you mentioned, are relatives of passengers from that Pan Am flight. They are being consoled by clergymen, by Pan Am officials.
There are about 100,000 public employees in the state. Of these, about 28,000 work for the state of Alabama. Most of these state employees are under the merit system and have specific regulations to follow when it comes to political activity.
An employee can express a private opinion as to his preference or her preference for a candidate. The Attorney General has ruled that a classified employee can even have a bumper sticker on an automobile. This matter has never been addressed by the personnel board, but to actively campaign and solicit votes or to make a political contribution to either a candidate or a party is prohibited.
Tommy Flowers says state law provides punishment for those who don't follow the rules.
As I recall, the code says anyone who violates this section shall vacate his position, meaning that a violation makes an individual subject to termination.
State law does allow employees to actively participate in campaigns, but not on the level they're employed. That is, a state worker can become involved in a local political race. According to Flowers, one reason for such strict laws about campaigning is because many years ago, almost every state job was filled through political appointments. Dennis Latham, WSFA TV News.
At news time, they were still playing the first round of this, the oldest golf tournament in the state. After morning play, Montgomery's Brad Braswell shared the lead with John Fridge of Mobile at 2 over par 72. Three local golfers, Conwell Hooper, Talbot Griffith, and Bill McGowan, were 2 strokes back at 74. Among those still on the course was Pensacola's Peter Dyson. He was at 3 under par after sinking that short putt for par on 14. He was the leader at that point. We'll have complete first round results for you tonight at 10. Second round play will begin tomorrow morning at 8 at Montgomery Country Club. Rick Pons, WSFA TV Sports.
It's a pity, but it's still a fact. An image has been created about men of the cloth, preacher men, if you please. It's not a very flattering image. Always they're on the portly side. They're not noted for their good looks. They're very reverential in their demeanor. And athletes they are not. Then along comes a preacher like Dr. John Ed Matheson of Fraser Memorial United Methodist Church, and he makes a mockery of that image. It's disgusting how slim and trim he is. He's a good-looking devil. No, that's a terrible choice of words. Make that a good-looking guy. It's hard to catch him without a smile on his face. And he may be one of the best all-around athletes in Alabama. John Ed Matheson was born 44 years ago, and the first time he ever posed for a photographer, aged 2 months, he had already developed that disarming grin that he still uses with effectiveness. And look at him when he was a year old. Other than your own kids, have you ever seen a cuter little boy? Being what they call in the trade a PK, a preacher's kid, John Ed lived in several places before the family settled in Opelika when he was 12. This is what the new kid in town looked like when he entered the 6th grade. John Ed's senior year at Opelika High School was memorable. He made the all-state basketball team, but much, much more importantly, it was during that year that he made the decision to spend the rest of his life working for the Lord. After graduating from Huntington College, Matheson earned a bachelor's degree in divinity from Emory, a master's degree from Princeton University, and then later he returned to Emory to earn his Doctor of Divinity degree. After serving churches in Mobile and Phoenix City, Matheson came to Montgomery in 1972 as pastor at Fraser Memorial. And what has happened at that church since that time has been nothing short of miraculous. Membership has increased from 400 to more than 3,000, making it not only Montgomery's largest church, but the fastest growing church in Alabama. At this moment, a new sanctuary is nearing completion, which will seat an astonishing 1,850 people. With 3 services now being held each Sunday morning, and Matheson preaches at all of them, he envisions sharing the Word of God with 5,000 people every Sunday. There's no way you can get John Ed Matheson to take any credit for the success of Fraser Memorial. He gives the glory to the Lord and a pat on the back to a hard-working staff and to some dedicated lay leaders. Throughout all these years, Matheson has remained one of the foremost tennis and racquetball players in Alabama and the South. He's won more state championships than any man around in both sports. Not surprisingly, the other members of the Matheson family are cut from the same mold as John Ed. There's his strikingly attractive wife, Joan, a Tuskegee native. They have a pretty daughter, Vicki, a 16-year-old junior at Jeff Davis, and 12-year-old Si, a spitting image of his old man and already a pretty fair basketball player himself. Dr. John Ed Matheson, maybe he doesn't fit the image of the typical preacher, but he's a remarkably effective witness for the Lord and a very interesting person.
Tommy Hill is the owner of Sports Acres Water Ski School here in Montgomery. He's also the #1 ranked pro slalom skier in the state. And after a first-place finish at the recently completed All-American tournament in Cypress Gardens, Florida, Hill is now ranked among the top slalom and trick skiers in the world. Tommy started skiing in college his sophomore year at Alabama, then turned pro in the fall of 1981. And he holds state records in 2 different divisions. Now, you would think a resume such as this would be enough to be invited to the Masters Ski Tournament, the Super Bowl of ski tournaments being held this weekend in Callaway Gardens, Georgia. But unfortunately, it wasn't.
Well, most of the skiers at the Masters this weekend are either world record holders or they've been to the World Championships and have been skied on either the United States team or one of the European teams. They only invite like 14 men out of the whole world, and usually there's 2 or 3 skiers from each country. Israel's represented, Great Britain, all the major countries that have water ski teams.
What do you feel you'll have to do to get there?
Well, I guess you have to either make the world team or break a world record.
Tommy says he will continue to improve his skiing skills, compete in every tournament he can, and hopefully earn an invitation to next year's Masters. Rick Pons, WSFA TV Sports.
Everybody look at your big famous smile.
Only a handful of men gathered around the state capitol steps this morning, but they were there to talk about problems they say may affect 15,000 people in Alabama. They're all veterans who took part in nuclear weapons testing conducted by the U.S. Defense Department, and they're all concerned that the test may have permanently damaged them and other servicemen. The National Association for Atomic Veterans was formed in 1979 as an advocacy group for vets who are concerned about what nuclear testing may have done to them. The deputy director of the association, Tom Saffer, has been traveling across the nation talking to atomic vets.
Wherever we go, we find the same kinds of things, that none of us were ever warned of the potential health consequences of our exposure, that families are being ruined and lives are being altered as a result of the illnesses that are resulting from radiation poisoning.
Among the medical complaints filed by the vets nationwide, cancer, muscle and bone deterioration, and internal disorders. Saffer believes his own health was damaged by 2 nuclear blasts he was within miles of. Saffer says one problem facing the vets is that none of their ailments can be directly linked to the nuclear test. Another problem, according to Saffer, is that the government isn't helping the vets. So Saffer and the others say they'll go on alone, trying to draw the vets together in hopes they can help themselves.
And we're not really being critical of the government. We're being critical of the Defense Department, who ordered us exposed and who promised that if anything ever happened to us, they'd take care of our ailments. And we're being critical of the Veterans Administration that just doesn't seem to understand.
Tom Ford, WSFA TV News.
Neither the AEA nor its parent organization, the NEA, is too happy with the signals they're picking up from President Reagan. They sense a growing insensitivity to the needs of public education. So the NEA did some signaling of its own.
And the basic message from that march was, Mr. President, public schools need help, and they need your support, not your attack.
When Dr. Hubbard puts increases in defense spending together with budget cuts in education, it doesn't add up.
National security depends as much upon the education of our citizenry and the development on their part of an understanding of democracy as having a bigger bomb or better gun or bigger and faster airplanes.
President Reagan has just recommended $500 tax breaks for parents with children enrolled in private schools. He calls it simple fairness. Dr. Hubbard calls it government subsidies for church schools that attract whites trying to avoid busing.
So the public schools could end up being the reservoir of those who could not afford private education or those who were too physically or mentally handicapped for private schools to be interested in them.
Dr. Hubbard wishes the president would make a similar investment in public education. When you total all the federal aid programs to public schools, the government never spends more than $200 on a child, says Dr. Hubbard, let alone the $500 tax break that could go to those in private schools. Susan Silvernail, WSFA TV News.
Like the high school graduating class, the college class. It's a fraternity of people that have
experienced something unusual. We're no better than anybody else, but we've experienced something unusual. So we get together and we talk about old times and swap a few stories, not all of them totally honest. But really, we banded together, and the motto of our national organization is to help those that can't help themselves. One of our chapter members gets in trouble and needs help, yeah, I'm going to give it to him. He's a friend of mine, even though he may have been in a Japanese prison camp and I was in Germany. There's still a bond of affection. And, that's what it's about.
How about the families now, the MIAs, the family members? They don't know what's happened to their people. They have no idea.
That's right, and that's a shame. You know, I guess you learn religion when you're incarcerated. You go through difficult times, and your religion grows deeper within you. And I think it's just a shame that God Almighty, in His infinite wisdom,